In a Somerset valley, one mill still turns. It has been grinding grain on the same spot for more than 600 years. Kings came and went. The wheel kept turning. The machine that does the work has no motor, no wiring, no fuel bill. It runs on falling water and a set of wooden gears a carpenter could have cut with a chisel. By every rule of modern engineering, a machine like that should have worn out and been scrapped generations ago. It didn't. And the reason it didn't is the part nobody tells you about medieval water power. Most of what you picture when you hear the word watermill is wrong. It was not a quaint wooden wheel. It was the most complex machine in the medieval world, and the villagers were often forbidden to build their own. A modern flour mill runs on electricity and gets scrapped in a generation. Today, we're going to take the medieval version apart and show you why it ran for 6 centuries on nothing but a river. The water they had to tame first. The wheel that quietly beat modern turbines for efficiency. The wooden gears built to break on purpose. The stones recut by hand every few weeks. And the iron grip the local lord kept on all of it. Miss one piece and the mill stops. Start with the water, because the wheel is the part everyone looks at, and the water is the part that actually did the engineering. A river does not hand you power. A river gives you a lot of water moving slowly, and that is close to useless for turning a heavy stone. What a mill needed was the opposite. A smaller amount of water, dropping from a height, at a moment of the miller's choosing. Getting that meant reshaping the landscape before a single gear was cut. They built a weir across the stream to raise the level. Then they cut a channel, the leat, that peeled off the top of that raised water and carried it along the contour of the hillside, staying high while the valley floor fell away beneath it. By the time the leat reached the mill, its water was running several feet above the river it came from. That height was the whole point. That height was stored energy. A pond behind the mill held a reserve, so the miller could grind through a dry afternoon on water he had saved that morning. A sluice gate let him open the flow when he wanted it and shut it dead when he didn't. None of that is glamorous. All of it is civil engineering that would keep a modern surveyor busy. And they did it with rope, pegs, and a level made of water in a trough. Get the fall of the leat wrong by a couple of inches over a quarter mile, and the whole thing either floods or runs dry. They got it right so often that many of those medieval channels still carry water today. Where there was no river to tap at all, they turned to the sea. Tide mills trapped the incoming tide behind a gate, held it in a pond, then let it pour back out through the wheel on the ebb, grinding to a clock set by the moon rather than the weather. A head of water, though, is still only potential. Something had to catch it. That something was the wheel, and here the medieval builder made a choice that decided everything downstream. There were 2 basic ways to hang a water wheel. The old Roman way, described by Vitruvius before the birth of Christ, was the undershot wheel. You stand it in the current and let the moving water push the bottom paddles. It is simple, it works in flat country, and it is badly inefficient. An undershot wheel captures maybe 1/5 to 1/3 of the energy in the water. The rest just shoves past and keeps going downstream. The better way was to bring that leat in over the top. An overshot wheel has buckets instead of flat paddles, and the water pours into the buckets at the very top of the wheel. Now the wheel is not being pushed. It is being pulled down by the sheer weight of water filling one side, bucket after bucket, while the empty buckets rise on the other. It turns because one side is always heavier than the other, and weight, unlike a current, gives up almost all of its energy. The numbers on this are the part that should stop you. A good overshot wheel runs at somewhere between 60 and 70% efficiency. Modern engineers who have gone back and tested surviving wheels keep finding the same thing. Those figures sit right in the range of a modern water turbine. A machine built by a village millwright with hand tools 500 or 600 years ago was pulling power out of a stream at an efficiency our own century treats as respectable. Where the land gave them the height, they built overshot. Where it did not, they built a breast-shot compromise, feeding the water in at axle height to split the difference. They were reading the ground and matching the machine to it. And grinding grain was only where the story started. Once you could turn a shaft with a river, you could drive almost anything, and medieval engineers set about driving everything. They geared water wheels to rows of heavy wooden hammers that pounded woolen cloth in water to thicken and clean it, a job called fulling that had once meant people treading the cloth in troughs for hours on end. They put wheels to work pumping the bellows and lifting the trip hammers of iron forges, sawing timber, crushing ore and oak bark for the tanneries, and mashing rag into pulp for the first paper mills. A single steep valley might hold a whole chain of mills strung along one stream, each tapping the same water in turn as it dropped from level to level, each replacing the labour of dozens of people who no longer had to do it by hand. This was the nearest thing the Middle Ages had to a power industry, and it ran on nothing but rain and gravity, and they built them everywhere. By 1086, the great survey we call the Domesday Book counted more than 6,000 watermills in England alone, roughly one for every 50 households in the country. Water was already doing the work of tens of thousands of arms. This was not a rare marvel in a few rich towns. It was the power grid of the Middle Ages, and it was running before the Normans had finished counting it. But a spinning wheel on its own grinds nothing. The wheel turns the wrong way, in the wrong plane, far too slowly. Everything useful happened next, inside the mill, in the dark. Follow the axle in through the wall, and you reach the cleverest part of the whole machine. The wheel turns a great horizontal shaft, slowly, maybe 6 or 8 times a minute. A millstone needs to spin fast, and it needs to spin flat, around a vertical axis. So the medieval millwright had to do 2 things at once. Turn the motion through 90 degrees and multiply the speed. He did it with gears cut entirely from wood. On the main shaft sat the pit wheel, a great toothed ring. It meshed with a smaller gear called the wallower, mounted on an upright shaft, and that turn of tooth against tooth swung the whole motion from horizontal to vertical. Up that vertical shaft, the great spur wheel drove a little gear called a stone nut. And because the stone nut was small and the spur wheel was large, the stone spun many times for every slow turn of the water wheel. A river crawling past the building was converted, through nothing but shaped wood, into a stone spinning fast enough to grind wheat to flour. Then comes the detail that tells you these people understood their machine better than we give them credit for. The gear teeth were not carved from the same wood as the wheels. They were separate pegs, cogs, driven into mortices and made from a different, harder timber, usually apple or hornbeam, greased with animal tallow. And they were meant to be the weakest thing in the mechanism. If a stone jammed, if something dropped into the works, if the load spiked, the strain went to those wooden cogs and a cog snapped. That was the trick, built in on purpose. Better to break a shilling's worth of applewood peg that a boy could replace before dinner than to shatter a pit wheel or crack a millstone that cost more than the miller earned in a year. Modern engineers have a name for this. They call it a sacrificial component, a designed weak point, the same idea as the shear pin that saves your outboard motor and the fuse that saves your house. We congratulate ourselves on it. A medieval millwright was doing it with a hand-cut apple peg and a pot of grease because he had worked out, without any theory at all, that a machine you can fix is worth more than a machine that never breaks. And there is a reason that knowledge stayed alive for so long, which we will come to. And the flour coming off those stones was not the end of the story. It was the start of a loaf. That part you can still do yourself. If watching this makes you want to put your own hands on the medieval world instead of just watching it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for keeping a living leaven the old way. And the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find real heritage grain. Because those stones did not stay sharp on their own, and keeping them cutting was a craft all its own. A pair of millstones looks like two plain discs. Look closer, and the working faces are carved with a pattern of grooves, furrows cut into the stone, with the flatlands left standing between them. That pattern is not decoration. As the top stone turns over the fixed bottom stone, the furrows of one cross the furrows of the other like the blades of a giant pair of scissors, and grain caught between them is not crushed so much as sheared, cut and swept outward from the centre to the rim as flour. Feeding the stones was its own small piece of engineering. Above them hung a hopper that trickled grain down a shaking chute called the shoe, kept rattling by a squared iron rod called the damsel, named by the millers for the endless chatter it made as it turned. Feed the stones too fast and you choked them and the flour came out coarse. Feed them too slow and they ran dry and scorched. The damsel's clatter was the miller's ear on the machine. When the note of it changed, something in the grind had changed too, and a good miller could hear trouble coming before he could see it. The best stone for the job came from specific places and nowhere else. French burr, a hard freshwater quartz quarried near Paris, was so prized that millers imported it across the channel in pieces and built it up into a single stone bound with iron and plaster. In England they cut millstone grit from the Pennine moors. The right stone was hard enough to hold an edge and open enough in its grain to keep biting. But no stone holds an edge forever. Grinding wore the furrows smooth, and a smooth stone stops cutting and starts heating, and hot flour is spoiled flour. So every few weeks the miller stopped the mill, lifted the top stone, and recut the entire pattern by hand with a chisel-like tool called a mill bill. Sharp flecks of steel and stone drove into the back of his hand as he worked, and a miller could prove his trade by showing those grey specks under his skin. That is where we get the phrase, to show your metal. He also had to hold the two stones a hair apart and never let them touch. Too far and the flour came out coarse. Too close and stone ground on stone, which sparked, and a mill full of fine flour dust is one spark away from an explosion. So the miller learned to judge the gap by feel, running the fresh meal between finger and thumb, adjusting the stones by tiny amounts through the day as the grain and the weather changed. The trade even left its mark on the man. A miller was said to have a golden thumb, and a fish that lives flat on riverbeds is called the miller's thumb to this day. This was skilled, dangerous, constant work, which raises the obvious question. If this machine was so valuable, who owned it, and who was allowed to use it? The answer is the last piece of the system, and the one that has no modern equivalent. In most of medieval Europe, you were not allowed to grind your own grain. The mill belonged to the lord of the manor, and the law of the manor, called soak, required every household on his land to bring their grain to his mill and pay for the privilege. Payment was taken in kind. The miller kept a fixed portion of every load, the multure, scooped straight from the flour. It made the miller one of the most resented men in the village, forever suspected of a heavy thumb on the measure, and it made the lord's mill a small permanent tax on daily bread. A family that ground a handful of oats at home was, in the eyes of the manor court, stealing. People pushed back the only way they could, with hand querns, two small stones they could turn at home in secret. Lords hunted these down. At St. Albans, the abbey confiscated the townspeople's hand mills and had the captured millstones set into the floor of the abbey parlour as a public trophy of who held the power. The town did not forget. When revolt swept England in 1381, The people of St. Albans marched into that abbey, tore the millstones up out of the floor, and broke them into fragments, handing the pieces around like relics. A grinding stone had become a symbol of freedom. That is how much a mill mattered. That monopoly is grim, but it is also the reason these machines lasted 600 years. A mill that valuable was worth maintaining forever. The Lord had every reason to keep it running, and around it grew a profession, the millwrights, travelling craftsmen who built, repaired, and understood the whole system. They carried the knowledge of leats and gear ratios and stone dressing from mill to mill and passed it down apprentice to apprentice, generation after generation, so the machine never had to be reinvented. A millwright could walk into a strange mill, listen to the damsel, watch the wheel, and know within an hour what was worn and what was true. The same design got refined, repaired, and handed on, which is exactly why a wheel laid out in the 13th century could still be turning in the 19th. So what finally stopped them was not that they wore out, it was that the world changed the rules underneath them. In the 1870s, a new way of milling spread out of Budapest and then Minneapolis, using rows of steel rollers instead of stone. Rollers ground faster, needed no dressing, and produced the pale, fine white flour that city buyers suddenly wanted. Steam, and later the electric motor, cut the last tie to the river, so a mill no longer had to sit where the water fell. It could sit beside a railway instead. Cheap flour poured in from vast new farms overseas. One by one, the country mills fell silent, not because the machine failed, but because the economy it served evaporated. The wheels did not break. The work simply left them. A few, though, were never quite let go. Kept turning by families and enthusiasts who could not bear to see them stop, a handful of these mills grind on even now, which is exactly why that wheel in the Somerset Valley is still turning today. And that is the quiet lesson standing in that Somerset Valley. We tend to assume old machines were crude and short-lived, and that progress means things that last. It was closer to the other way around. The medieval mill was built to be understood by the person fixing it, made of parts a village could replace. Designed so the cheapest piece failed first, and maintained by a craft that treated it as a thing to keep alive, rather than a thing to use up. It ran for 6 centuries because everyone who touched it expected it to outlast them. Most of what we build now is designed to be replaced before it is paid off. The mill was designed to be inherited. Subscribe to Medieval Way, where we dig up the machines the modern world scrapped. Which surprised you most, the gears or the stones? Until next time.